Every week here on Shift Key, we find one piece of climate or energy news to pull out. If that news item is making us feel more upbeat about the energy transition, we call it an upshift. If it's making us feel more downbeat, it's a downshift. That's because our show is called Shift Key. Jesse, what do you have for us?
Well, as the saying goes, there's no energy transition without transmission. I know some people say that. You might not say that.
I say that, actually.
But that's because expanding electricity transmission is critical to keep up with demand growth, which is soaring now with data centers and electrification of vehicles and advanced manufacturing and everything else coming to America. And it's necessary to tap into the best renewable resources, particularly wind power, because you got to build wind farms where it's windy. And that isn't typically where a lot of people live. So we need to dramatically expand the pace at which we are building out the transmission grid. And I would say that different grid operators around the country get different scores for that in terms of how proactive they are about this. But one that has been consistently pretty good at looking ahead at the scale of transmission expansion needed is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, which runs the grid that serves a lot of the Great Lakes region, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North South Dakota, Iowa, et cetera, as well as parts of the South all the way down through Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana. They have now released an updated long-term transmission plan that includes an investment of over $21.8 billion in expanding regional transmission in the northern portion of their grid, so the Great Plains and Great Lakes portion, including a new ultra-high voltage, 765 kilovolt backbone grid. That's the highest alternating current voltage that we typically have in the grid today. And there's only a few parts of the U.S. grid where we have a big high voltage backbone like that. Think of it sort of like the interstate highway, like superhighway for power. They plan to build a new backbone grid that spans across the northern portion of their system, as well as a number of upgraded or new 345 kV lines. All that's expected to help connect about 120 gigawatts of new supply and save substantial amounts of energy by improving reliability and resilience to outages and other kinds of events. It's a lot of new transmission investment. It's going to move forward to actual specific project planning and development. They hope that these lines will be online in the 2030 to 2032 timeframe. So these should very quickly progress if they want to do that to specific projects. Some of these I think have already advanced further than others in terms of permitting. But it's the kind of broad region-wide scale of planning that we need to see. In fact, we really should be seeing this type of regional planning extend beyond the boundaries of an individual grid operator like MISO and across the country, across the entire interconnection. This is not their first large long-term transmission plan. They've actually recently completed a tranche of multiple projects, all intended to work together to expand grid connection as well over the last decade. And so more coming down the line in MISO, and I hope that other grid operators start to lean in the same way that they are.
Someone once explained to me, back when I reported on the SunZia transmission line in Arizona and New Mexico, which is obviously in the Southwest, the whole question of the transition, arguably, is there's all this wind and solar resources in the middle of the country, and there's all this demand on the coasts, or at least along the I-5 and I-95 corridor. And through Texas, right? But Texas is its own system. Can we get all the abundant energy resources we have in the middle of the country to the coast? That's like the whole question. And the only answer is transmission for that.
Yeah. And I mean, the challenge right now is, can we even get it to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Chicago?
Yes,
right.
That's
and
true.
then from there, let's try to get it further east as well. And so the MISO grid at least focuses on that challenge of how do we get it to the major load centers in the eastern portion of MISO. Then the nice thing would be if we could then expand that transmission grid, all the way to New Jersey or New York on the coasts.
Is there significant transmission between Chicago and the East Coast, the Mid-Atlantic? Because they're in the same grid operator, but they're not really connected, right?
There is American Electric Power AEP that operates out of Ohio and other similar states, does have a 765 kV backbone grid as well in the PJM system. That was built out a long time ago, and it has not expanded much recently, although they are talking about it now with a lot of data centers pushing demand for that area. There is east-west interconnection, but it is consistently constrained basically across the Appalachian Mountains. There's only a certain number of places where you can build transmission lines across the Appalachian, and those lines are at max capacity. And if we want to bring more power from the Midwest to the East Coast, we're going to have to expand some of those east-west paths.
It's the Blue Ridge. It's the Front Range in the Rockies. It's the Blue Ridge in the Appalachians.
Exactly. What do you got, Rob?
Okay, so I have an upshift. It's from Heatmap's own reporter, J.L. Holtzman. She reports that the Bureau of Land Management has now permitted a solar project in Yuma County, Arizona. It's permitted the Leeward Renewables Elizabeth Solar Project in Yuma County. It's also allowed a separate solar project also in Arizona to proceed. These are the first renewable permits granted by the Trump administration and granted by the Bureau of Land Management. And they're significant because if you remember, Donald Trump came into office and immediately paused all renewable permitting across the country. Since then, I would say the Trump administration has been hostile, especially to offshore wind, incredibly hostile to offshore wind. In fact, we should talk about that more. But it has quietly begun to approve these solar projects. And that's significant because a lot of the progress, a lot of the decarbonization that proceeded under the first Trump administration happened in solar. A lot of it requires these agencies to just do the basic yeoman's work of government and approve these projects that come before them in a normal, non-prejudicial way. And I think this is the first evidence that that is now going to happen, at least in BLM. BLM is a sub-agency of the Department of Interior, which is overseen by Secretary, former Governor Doug Burgum, who has said more amenable things about energy production.
Including wind power, right?
Including wind power. He also yanked permits. He also yanked permits from an offshore wind farm a few weeks ago. So, I hesitate to be too complimentary, but I think this is a sign that after some of the initial pandemonium of the Trump administration for large-scale solar specifically, things are a little bit back to business as usual for some of these agencies receiving, reviewing, and approving large-scale solar permits. We also know from jail's reporting that there's some interest in increasing solar on public lands. And so I think it's an upshift. I think it's not an upshift as compared to the baseline of a year ago, but it's an upshift as compared to the baseline of January 21st, 2025. And so I'm going to call it an upshift.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And did want to note how low a bar it is when a federal agency simply doing its statutory obligated duty of permitting projects proposed in a timely and reasonably neutral manner is an upshift. But you're right. And I think the big question I still have is what about onshore wind, both on public lands and also private lands in cases where it does engage with the federal government, where it needs an environmental impact statement or crosses a federal highway or a water body or something like that needs some kind of federal permitting. We can do a lot with solar and batteries. If you look at the bulk of planned expansion of new supply on the US grid, it's solar, and the bulk of the new capacity is batteries. But we really need wind to be pulling its own too. It is an important American energy resource. It historically is the largest contributor of the renewables to our mix. It's about 10%. So half as much of our existing nuclear fleet, more than hydro combined. And if we're going to take wind off the table because Trump doesn't like it or some other ideological reason, it really does limit America's ability to keep up with demand growth in the most affordable way. And that could really constrain our role in the AI race globally. It could strain our ability to meet data center demand. It could raise energy prices for consumers.
Matter for electricity prices. And this is the crazy thing about all the Trump administration energy policy that still doesn't quite check out, but I guess it's a good sign on the solar, is that Trump, in his second inaugural address, talks about the importance to a manufacturing base of having low electricity prices. It seems to be one of these core tenets of energy policy that he grasps, or at least that someone in his immediate circle grasps. And yet when you look at the energy policy the Trump administration is doing, it's like, let's export as much gas as possible and let's try to constrain, which raises gas prices and which therefore has a second order effect of raising electricity prices. Well, actually, I mean, let's actually back up, right? When you look at Trump energy policy as a whole, it's let's encourage OPEC to drill more oil, which reduces U.S. oil production, which reduces U.S. natural gas co-production, because right now we produce a lot of natural gas as a byproduct of oil drilling. What that means is it makes the median price of U.S. natural gas go up, which causes more U.S. natural gas drilling. At the same time, we're trying to export more natural gas. And in fact, we know that regardless of what happens during Trump's term, we're going to bring on massive new amounts of U.S. natural gas export potentials. So we know gas prices are going up through a number of factors, or we would expect them to go up through a number of factors, regardless of what else happens. At the same time, we're constraining all sorts of other energy production that would reduce the strain on the gas grid. It's like a recipe for higher electricity prices, even though the president has talked about how important low energy prices and low electricity prices are specifically to his dream of reindustrializing the US. And that's setting aside how much the US was already embarking on a project of reindustrialization that his agencies are now throwing into question because they don't like the IRA or they don't like these bipartisan projects that came out of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, which was passed by a bipartisan Senate. I mean, it's like fractal incoherence as an energy policy, right? It's like wherever you drill, it doesn't quite make sense. And the recipe is higher prices everywhere. At least, hey, Jesse, at least they approved this one solar project. We'll take what we can get. Let's leave it there. And that does it for Upshift Downshift. If you enjoyed this segment, find our whole podcast, because we do a whole hour of this every week. And we don't just talk about what's making us feel good or bad. We talk about other topics in energy. Our podcast is called Shift Key. You can find it at heatmap.news. That's heatmap.news. You can also find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Deezer, wherever you get your podcasts, you're going to find Shift Key. If you enjoyed this, of course, you could also like and subscribe. Please do. And email us. You can find us at shiftkey@heatmap.news. We want to hear what you have to say. Thanks for listening, as always.